We are group 43 and we will be discussing systematic racism in the education system in the United States between 1990 and 2021. Hi, I'm Sonoma Frederick and I will be doing the introduction to racism in schools and education. Systematic racism and how it presents itself in the education system. So, to start off, what is systematic racism? Well, systematic racism can be defined as racism that is incorporated and deeply ingrained into how a system is run. The racism ingrained in the education system goes back to the Jim Crow era in the 1870s. During this time, schools were segregated, and people justified this because black and white schools were considered to be separate but equal. However, this is not really true. In my head, when considering this idea of separate but equal schools, I drew a connection to the ideas of early anthropologists we learned about in this term, like Spencer and LeConte, who believed that different races should be kept separate. Second, schools that are attended mostly by people of color often tend to be underfunded. This can be an example of the racism ingrained into the education system because, as a result of this, students of color receive less opportunities in comparison to their white counterparts, regardless of talent or intelligence. Finally, students of color can face greater roadblocks when it comes to education. A quote from one of our sources stated that a recent study found that college professors spanning race and gender respond more consistently to questions and requests from students with white sounding names. Obviously, this unequal treatment can lead to students of color having greater difficulty learning, especially in higher levels of education. How is modern racism seen in the education system? Modern racism can manifest itself in multiple different ways in the education system today, like through hate speech, ethnocentric beliefs, and teachers' low expectations of students of color. First, regarding hate speech, if students of color attend predominantly white schools, sadly, there is a high chance they will experience discrimination and harassment. Next, many schools fail to educate their students on different cultures. Therefore, if students do not gain the ability to understand people different from them, it will create further biases and beliefs of superiority. Lastly, the idea that teachers have low expectations for students of color ties into the concept of a hereditarian view on intelligence that we were learning earlier in this term. Many psychologists believe that intelligence was fixed, and races that they believed to be inferior innately had a lower IQ. How to assess racism in the education system. First, the human rights approach. The human rights approach questions what we can do to counteract the racism we see in the education system. For example, how can we stop the spread of hate speech? This approach seeks out ways to actively practice anti racism every day. Second, an emphasis on multiculturalism can help to educate students on the history of racism from the perspective of people of color, rather than white people who have a biased perspective of historical events. Additionally, uplifting the voices of Black students can help marginalized groups express their attitudes and provide solutions to the problem. Finally, the critical race theory approach works to highlight the parts of the education system that make it unequal, like teachers' low expectations of students of color or the disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsion among students of color. This technique works to strip down the system to its core and assess how deeply racism is ingrained.
So for my part, I'm going to talk a bit about the background of this topic. Before I begin, I would like to apologize for my accents because English is not my native language and sometimes I might not be that fluent in using this language. And so our topic focuses on systematic racism in the United States alone within the recent 2 decades. Let us look a bit into the history of systematic racism in the United States. In the 1870s, the first public school for African Americans was established after the Civil War. However, it was around the same time that the Jim Crow laws were implemented, most particularly in the southern states. They provided a legal ground for segregation within the education sector to be legal. It was branded under the principle that all race groups will receive the same quality of education. However, in reality, that was not the case. It was not until 1955 that segregation in schools were illegal within the whole country. It was changed by the court ruling of Board versus Board of Education versus Brown, and the court ruled that any form of segregation in schools were illegal. However, there was still de facto segregation as things won't change in a night. So gradually in the 60s and the 70s, de facto segregation in schools also declined. Most particularly after the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It suspended all laws of segregation. So you might ask, why is this issue important? Isn't segregation something in the past and it was long over? Isn't it? Well, first of all, the juror segregation was only abolished relatively recently, and its implementation was also not too far from modern history. Many living members of the society still have experiences of segregation within the society that they live in every day. And moreover, it is also important for us to learn history to prevent making the same mistakes from the past. Another important reason to look into this issue is that from the 1990s onwards, there were increasing traces of de facto segregation again. This was due to the lack of interaction between racial groups, and this can be also due to systematic reasons, which we will study at the later slides. Let us talk a bit about the court ruling. Before the ruling, most northern states already banned segregation by law. However, there was also some sort of de facto segregation within these states. And some other states also have no legislation or made segregation optional. However, all southern states practice segregation by law within schools. After the court ruling that banned segregation, an average white southerner opposed it. If we apply today's standard, we might find this ridiculous. However, we cannot simply apply today's moral standards and look at these people. We have to understand why they thought it that way at that time. Perhaps it was a conflict between states' rights and civil rights, perhaps for other social reasons, and that is also why this issue is important to be looked into. So, is systematic racism a myth or reality? Actually, since the 1990s, there were increasing signs of de facto segregation, which I have already mentioned, and part of the reasons can be due to social factors as well. So we cannot solely blame systematic reasons for this part. However, systematic reasons probably also have a role to play. Moreover, institutionally, are students really treated fairly? Why do black students face more punishment than other students? Are there other factors involved, perhaps, for example, income class, family background? And do these factors have a role to play in systematic racism? Moreover, if we look into the interpersonal perspective, why do students of different ethnicity treat others so differently? And these are the reasons why we have to look into this case.
In this section, I'll be discussing the various factors in relation to systematic racism and racial prejudice within the U.S. education system. Study conducted by CNN indicates how racial prejudice is evident among youth. Silent racism can be brought to schools via subconsciousness of household teachings. White bias is also persistent, in which it further affects internalized racism, that is, influencing children of color to also see themselves through negative attributes. As seen in the doll study, students of color also pointed to the figures with darker skin tone, associating it with the context of being least favorable to society. Thus,
Thus, children are being subconsciously impacted by the racial ideology of white supremacy, in which white children are utilizing implicit bias in schools, and students of color are experiencing internalized racism by mainstream society dominated by whiteness. Hence, what are further examples of interpersonal racism in schools, and what other factors influence the severity of racial prejudice within the education system? The graph presented on the right indicates how school fundings are solely based on the racial composition of the institution, thus indicating systemic racism. Because segregation is mainly based on the population of racial and ethnic minorities, students of color tend to take on higher loan debt in regards to the racial wealth gap. Additionally, students of color have a higher dropout rate not only due to the economic factor of segregation, but also racial profiling. Many school institutions have law enforcement on property, which can heavily influence a student's mental health. This is because Black students tend to be more severely punished than white students.
The graph shows how The graph shows how students of color, especially Black students, experience suspension and expulsion at much higher rates. This is largely due to the racism that is ingrained into the education system. As we can see, white students are given much more grace and experience far less punishments.
Conclusion. Relation to current events. Black students are Black students are much more likely to be suspended or expelled from schools even as soon as preschool because of behavior. This is true throughout the education kindergarten till 12th grade, a cycle that can be somewhat connected to the idea of a poverty trap, where since it's hard for POC to get jobs, the families live in places that are more in poverty, which means that the funding for the schools in that area aren't as good as the funding in nicer areas. Students are already at a disadvantage in their learning because they aren't getting the materials they need. Non-Black students of color, including Black, Indigenous, and other students of color, attend schools that are statistically more likely to be under-resourced, inadequate, and in many cases dangerous to their health. This often leads to increased dropout rates from students of color, making it more difficult for them to receive higher level, higher paying jobs later in life. And when that time comes, they're less likely to get a job interview if the application has a Black sounding name. The recent Black Lives Matter movement has helped influence a variety of topics outside the issue of police brutality, even though that was the main issue on why the movement started. Help, the movement helped to raise awareness and educate people on the inequality the BIPOC community faces day to day as a result of how our society is structured and how it operates on the white supremacy foundation of this country. Racism in the education system is rooted of many other inequalities BIPOC face, including income and school to prison pipeline. The preconceptions that underpin this discussion overlook a crucial fact. Minority children's educational performance are considerably more a function of their unequal access to essential educational resources, such as qualified teachers and high quality curriculum, than of their race. Advocates must support inclusive and diverse schools that provide more opportunities for BIPOC adolescents and low-income students. To attend college, Black students frequently take on more debt than white students, making it all the more difficult to acquire money in the future. Black students are more likely to be excluded from study groups, to encounter racism on campus, and to have difficulty forming close bonds with faculty members and other staff. Institutionalized racism is a poisonous and pervasive problem in today's society, and we all will have to do a superior job in addressing it in our schools, communities, and oneself.